welcome everyone. We'd like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land and everywhere we are sitting at the moment. We'd like to pay respect to the Wurundjeri elders past, present and emerging, and if there are any present tonight, particular respect to those people. I'd like to acknowledge Wes Galt. I've spotted Wes Galt from the Glenferrie ward. Asher Judah up the back. So Asher is a Liberal candidate for Ashwood, upcoming election. Welcome, Asher. Look, we've got a great lineup tonight, and this is so exciting for Victoria to be looking at, well, not more than just looking at offshore wind. So we're going to hear all about it from two great speakers. Naomi Campbell, Star of the South, and from Pat Simons, Yes to Renewables at Friends of the Earth, or FO as they're affectionately known. Naomi will speak first. Naomi is the Development Director at Star of the South, where she's worked for over 3 years. Naomi has over 12 years of experience in the offshore wind industry, predominantly in the UK, so I here now an Australian citizen with her partner here tonight, which currently, and the UK currently has almost 13 gigawatts of offshore wind in operation. To put that in context, Australia averages about 25 gigawatt at, on the average. So 13 gigawatts of offshore wind in operation and 86 gigawatts in development in the UK, making it one of the largest markets for this technology, particular technology. Naomi studied ocean science and coastal management at university and has worked in diverse roles, including executive leadership, development management, environmental impact assessment and environmental monitoring during construction, which included 3 months of offshore working. Naomi directs the approvals and land assembly teams within the Star of the South and lives in Melbourne with her husband Colin. So, welcome Naomi.
Well, hello everybody. It's wonderful to be here, and I just would like to thank you and everyone at Lighter Footprints for inviting us along tonight, and for Mick and Lynn especially, who have supported us to come to speak with you. So, thank you for the introduction. I won't spend too much more time on me. I think you're much more interested to hear about Star of the South. And this presentation will really just focus on a general overview of the project. And maybe it'd be nice just to start by seeing a few hands. How many people in the room are familiar with Star of the South as an offshore wind farm project? Ah, brilliant, look at that. So, I mean, that's wonderful, because it's a first of project, which means that it's not something that, especially up till very recently, was on many agendas in Australia in terms of a potential green technology for Australia. But an opportunity arose back in 2017, which three founders, analysed and saw that there was a real opportunity, especially off the coast of Gippsland, to site an offshore wind farm, a large offshore wind farm that had the potential to generate up to 2.2 gigawatts of electricity, which, to put in context, the Nolan coal-fired power station has a nameplate at 1.48 gigawatts. So this is the size of and excess of a coal-fired power station out in the ocean off the coast of Gippsland. And in 2017, they approached the federal government and they told them that there was this potential opportunity to enable offshore wind development in Australia by allowing for an exploration licence, so a licence that permitted a developer to come and start exploring this area off the coast of Gippsland for offshore wind resource. And the federal government agreed that would be a good idea. So an exploration licence was awarded, and we started work with that exploration licence in 2019, and I'll run through some of the studies we've been doing since then. But so the momentum on the project has really started in the last sort of 3 years, but boy, hasn't it grown since then. And actually, we are the first, but we are no longer the only proposed offshore wind farm, and we're going into a bit of detail on that too. Okay. So let's start with About Star of the South. I've mentioned a couple of these things already, but there's the location you can see on a map. And it's off this coast of South Gippsland. Closest point is just sort of in between McLaughlin's and Reeves Beach. And that's roughly about 7 kilometres from the coastline. The water depth sort of varies from about 20 to 40 metres in water depth, so it's a really good water depth for offshore wind development and proven technology such as monopiles. The site itself, 496 kilometres squared. So when we looked at the capacity for a size of that, a project of that footprint, 2.2 gigawatts is absolutely achievable. And it's also a size of project that fits in very well with what's available in terms of the capacity that exists at Hazelwood. So if you know the area, you'll know that the Latrobe Valley has several sort of coal-fired power stations, and historically it had a very large one called Hazelwood, which closed. And the actual sort of network, so the transmission network that existed that serviced Hazelwood, which is 500 kV network that goes to Melbourne, that network at the moment has basically capacity available for renewable energy developments such as us. And that's why, if you like, when we looked at the size of the project, we saw this opportunity to be able to feed into that existing transmission network and service Victoria and Melbourne. So the project includes up to 200 turbines, and we have our transmission system, and you can see the landfall there on Reeves Beach. We looked at sites all the way along the coast for landfall, but that was the site that first is close enough to the wind farm that you're hitting shore as soon as possible, which for engineers, they love that. But equally, in terms of the constraints that are along that particular stretch of coastline, there's some protected sites, lakes of importance in terms of national parks and Ramsar wetlands. So it's actually quite a sensitive site, as well as Aboriginal sort of heritage. So it isn't that there's a lot of locations that you can put a cable in when you come onto land, but when we analysed it, Reeves Beach seemed the most favourable for the particular landfall. We then looked at a few variations on the cable route itself, and in the beginning of the project, the founders very quickly realised that transmission, especially in this area where they suffered the fires from the events that they had, I think, back 10 years ago, those really serious fires, that it was really important to them that transmission was underground. So we committed to underground transmission very early on in the project. And so we had 3 options about where the route was going to go. And we went out to the community with the 3 options, and we consulted on those. And we undertook a multi-criteria analysis, so that's where you look at all aspects of it, what the community think, what the landholders think, the engineers, how much it costs, the environmental impact. And we were able to, if you like, narrow it down to this selected route here, which then transits up to Gifford. And then from Gifford, it sort of runs close to and sometimes parallel to the Basslink, if you know that particular project, which is an overhead cable, before connecting into the Latrobe Valley. And we've got 2 possible connection points. We've got the Loy Yang power station, or if we need to, we can extend into Hazelwood. So we've got those 2 options available to us. The other aspect that's really important for an offshore wind farm in terms of assets is the port. So ports are necessary for the assembly of parts, especially. Sometimes those ports also involve the fabrication of particular elements, but mostly it's around assemblage. And when you think about 200 turbines and the infrastructure you need to install those, you do need quite a large space in a port to be able to muster that. And it may be one port, it may be multiple ports. It's fair to say that renewable projects are not always liked in terms of what they represent in particular communities. But what we have found over time, especially around the world, is that when we go offshore, some of those very key areas that are often I guess areas that people find challenging when they're developing onshore renewables are less so offshore. So specifically visual impact, I guess, is an area, plus land use, sort of using land for renewables as opposed to, agriculture or something else. I'll talk about the diversification in a minute, but the other key thing about offshore wind is just the jobs that you get from this particular technology. Now, the offshore environment, for anyone who might have worked offshore or has, sort of spent time on vessels, etc., it's not an easy life out on the boat. It's a harsh environment, and weather changes. You need to have crew. You need to have, people around you who can deal with that and get you out of any kind of trouble you might be in, but also, who are, if you like, sort of there to make sure that you don't need to keep going back to shore if you forget something, or if you need to have an extra person, you've got them there. So the actual industry creates much more jobs than maybe what you typically see with some of the other renewable energy technologies, just because the fact that to service these offshore wind farms, you need many more jobs, and I'll touch a bit more on that as we go through. Now, I mentioned we're the first, but we're not the only. I know the text has gone very small, but at the bottom it says that there are now 20 gigawatts of offshore wind that has been, if you like, proposed around the coast of Australia. And there's a website that I can direct you to, which shows you where those wind farms are being proposed. But predominantly, it's in and around Victoria, but you have some up New South Wales, especially around Newcastle, and then some in Western Australia. Those tend to be the pockets, with a few in Tasmania and South Australia. So diversification, I'll just touch on that quickly, and this is probably one of the key things that we found really gave some traction to the why offshore wind and why here. So this map that you see showing this red area, that is boom data that was collected over a course of about 10 years, and it shows a particular weather pattern that happens in Melbourne in the summer, where you get these really hot days in Melbourne, and I've experienced those in the last 3 years. And on those very hot days, you tend to get quite strong winds out over in the west of Victoria, especially in the morning. But then roughly about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the wind changes. And that's, I've noticed it myself, because, you get this rush of wind coming through. And this is where the wind starts to blow stronger offshore. So what we actually find is that the wind really drops on the western side of Victoria, where most of the onshore wind farms at the moment are clustered. Obviously the sun goes down, but the wind is still blowing very strong out here in the Basque Coast and off the coast of Gippsland. So in those sort of conditions, what we found is if Star of the South existed at that point in time, when that condition was being actualised in terms of felt, then the Star of the South would have filled some of that capacity need that then is driven by the fact that the onshore renewables out on the west side of Victoria start to drop off. So it fits really well in terms of how the assemblage of renewables across a land mass and into the sea can be placed so that you can ensure that you've got consistency of supply throughout the day, throughout different conditions. So it's been a good few years, I must say, especially in the last year. We've seen quite a lot of movement, especially from both federal and state governments. Now, we are a pioneer in this industry, which means that, in the beginning, as I mentioned, there's quite a lot of work to go and convince people that this is a good thing to do here in Australia. But then we worked first with the Commonwealth Government, especially, and I mentioned that exploration licence, and they saw that it was a good idea to give a proponent like Star of the South an opportunity to see whether the resource is strong enough and whether there's a financial business case for an offshore wind farm here in Australia. But then last year, they announced that they were also going to regulate an offshore electricity industry, and they delivered an act into Parliament called called the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act, which actually became law, became statute on the 2nd of June this year. That allows the Commonwealth Government to release their seabed for the use of offshore electricity in a very regulated and controlled manner. It allows also for proponents such as Star of the South to apply to the Commonwealth Government for the right to build, operate and decommission a wind farm in Commonwealth waters. At the same time last year, the Victorian Government announced their Energy Innovation Fund, which was a $40 million fund that was there to kickstart particular aspects of clean energy, and they had a first round which was dedicated to offshore wind, and Star of the South was successful in that, which was great, and we managed to secure a £43.1 million, not pound, still do that, partnership with the Victorian Government, which again is really great to see that investment. And then we had this document come out, which again was an absolute wonder to see if you're in my position, which is a document the Victorian Government has produced, where they've set out targets for offshore wind, and they basically put in this document that they had an unprecedented amount of renewable energy that they must deliver to decarbonise Victoria's energy system, and that it's more than 15 times today's installed renewable capacity, and thus they see that offshore wind can deliver at the scale it needs to deliver, and they've set some targets in there. So first power by 2028, so that means the first electricity from the first wind farm by 2028, and then they want to have 2 gigawatts operational by 2032, and then at least 9 gigawatts operational by 2040. It's quite simple, really. Well, I'm sure an engineer will tell me I'm mistaken, but it's turbines in the sea, and they're fixed to the seabed by these piles, as I mentioned, and then there are cables that run the electricity from the wind turbine when it generates to a substation where it's collected. It's then ramped up to a higher voltage. It's then what they call exported and transmitted to the shore. And then at the shore, it goes under the beach and then off through the land. It gets collected at certain substations because if you're familiar with wind generation, the wind itself, the way it blows, it can create these harmonics in the electricity, which you need to filter out to make sure that when it comes to being transmitted to the NEM, there's none of that oscillation in the electricity. It's nice and smooth. So we have these substations that help with that, and then it gets connected into the NEM at, hopefully, the Latrobe Valley, so either Loy Yang or Hazelwood. Size-wise, turbines offshore are big, and they're getting bigger. So the Star of the South has an envelope at the moment, so we haven't yet chosen our offshore turbine that we're going to use. Still some way from doing that. But our turbines range from 12 megawatt up to the 18 megawatt, and you can see the comparison in terms of height. So the Eureka Tower here in Melbourne, if you're familiar with that, it's higher than that in terms of the size of the 18 megawatt machines. At the moment, 90% recyclable. So most parts, apart from the blades are sort of made by fiberglass, but we've got our first fully recyclable offshore wind turbine being produced by Siemens, and they're rolling that out this year. So let's hope by the time we get our turbines, that'll be the same for us. Construction and operation, I mean, these are just sort of pictures. I've sort of explained that it's a big operation, and plenty of jobs in that space, and specialist sort of specialist installation engineers. Lots of activity during construction, and there's some pictures from that. Ports, oops. Oh, it's gone quite far. Ports, we mentioned space for storage, and you can see there some pictures in terms of the ports and what you could potentially expect to see at some of the ports in Melbourne if we manage to be successful. Timing-wise, get asked a lot, when are you going to start construction? Well, it typically takes 6 to 10 years. to get to that point, and we're still in the feasibility and development stage. But we're now 3 years into that. So signs are looking good in terms of where we're at, and we're tracking where we should be, but we've still got a lot to do, especially around the environmental approvals, the planning aspects, but also, you know, getting all the necessary licenses that we need to be able to get to a point where we give our owners the certainty that they can invest, because the cost of construction for a project of this is between $8 and $10 billion. So it's a lot of money, and it needs if you like, a collaboration of investors, lenders, often in the form of very large banks, who have particular, if you like, criteria that you have to meet to get the lending opportunity from them. And that's why, you know, it's really important that we deliver a really solid opportunity for them that has all of the necessary tick boxes done. So quickly, 2 years of surveys offshore. We started surveying in November 2019. We've done 2 years worth of marine ecology surveys, got a whole raft of different providers, and I'll show you a quick diagram that shows those. But you know, it's been small activity on the surface of things. It's mostly been boats and planes and a bit of wind and wave measurement, but a lot of activity behind the scenes, getting that all planned and executed. Plus the big piece, the community and stakeholder engagement, and making sure that we've kept the community in Gippsland especially up to date as we've gone on and engaged with them in terms of the activities that we've been undertaking. So this is the collaboration that we've had on our marine side. So you can see that we've been working with the universities. Curtin University have done sort of underwater noise monitoring for us. Deakin has been tagging seals and birds. We've also had some of the UK providers, so APEM, they're an aerial digital survey company, and I'll show you some of their images, who've been looking particularly at birds and flight heights. And then we've had local experts like Biosis, who you may be familiar with. They also do impact assessment work for onshore wind farms, but they're a seabird, shorebird specialist, and they've been able to do surveying as well as impact assessment. Then we've got Monash, and that's a chap called Rowan Clark there, who's been really helping us significantly with our studies, and then a collaboration with CSIRO looking at great white shark. Here are some images, so you can see the APEM photographs. These are photographs they take from the planes using a really high resolution camera, and they're able to ID birds. So from the particular colours of the birds, they can tell type of bird, whether it's male, female, you know, whether it's on the water, whether it's flying. And then there's also a LiDAR that tells you what height it's flying, so that we can look at particularly whether it's in the rotor swept area of the wind turbine. This is specific, you know, this is very important when it comes to collision risk and making sure that when we come to impact assessment, we're not, if you like, colliding with a lot of birds. So we have to make sure we've studied that thoroughly. Some images of the whales. We've got humpbacks, southern rides, pygmy blues. So it's really important that we know where they are when they're moving through the area. Are they foraging? Are they migrating? Do they have calves? All those sort of things. Tagging, those just shows you some of the tag results. So we've got fur seals, Australian fur seals, you can see are tagged over here, and then black-faced cormorants here. And this is really important data because we can't see the birds at night, so we need to know what they're doing 24/7. So tagging really informs that, helps us understand what their behaviour is throughout the entire sort of day cycle, month cycle, season. Community and business, so this is the last couple of slides here. Just to touch on the jobs, up to 3,000 direct Australian jobs, you know, during that operational phase. So that shows you in terms of scale, you know, we are looking at a significant contribution, especially down in Gippsland, where we predicted up to 760 construction jobs and 200 long-term jobs as well. So good, reasonable numbers, especially considering, a renewable project such as this. At the moment, we're focused on skills and upskilling and working with the, sort of local providers to see what opportunities there might be for them. And we've opened our ICN, which is a portal that you can log on to and register your business with, so that you make yourself known to us and we can make you known to our supply chain. So I think that is about it. Yes, last one, just communities. There you are. We could try and go out to Gippsland as much as possible, and it's always really very much welcome to come and talk to you guys and talk to other groups. So thank you very much for inviting us along, and I think I will probably end it there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
The next speaker, the second speaker, is Pat Simons, Friends of the Earth's Yes to Renewables Coordinator, and sits on the board of Friends of the Earth Asia Pacific. Pat campaigns alongside workers, businesses and regional communities to accelerate the transition to wind and solar and tackle the climate crisis. He has played a central role campaigning for Victoria's renewable energy target, most recently fought for national legislation to kickstart offshore wind, and Pat believes building social licence for large-scale renewable energy and bringing communities along the journey is the key to transforming the energy system this decade. Welcome to Pat Simon.
It's hard to talk about offshore wind and climate action without mentioning the recent climate election. And so I just want to, put your hands up if you're happy with the result. Okay, cool. And leave your hand up. Leave your hand up if you were involved in the recent campaigns at the federal level. Yeah, awesome. I think groups like Lighter Footprints do deserve a big pat on the back. For years of work, building the groundswell in communities in places like this, in seats like Kooyong and so on, that has just made such a big difference over a long time to get us where we are now, and it's really exciting. But let's leave it at that, and we'll go on and we'll talk about offshore wind, which is a really important part of this story as well. So we've obviously heard from the Star of the South about this, what is really a flagship project. Australia's first offshore wind proposal. I can remember being in the Latrobe Valley, years back when it was first announced, and it was a game-changing moment, because until that point there weren't really any many large-scale renewable energy projects that were being proposed for the Gippsland region. There are a few operating wind farms in Gippsland, but the majority of the projects are built in Western Victoria. And so when the Star of the South was first announced, we saw that as an incredible opportunity to make sure that the transition to renewable energy benefited regions like the Latrobe Valley, which have really contributed a massive amount to the state's energy history, but are also going through this really challenging transition. Where there's a need to create new jobs, new economic opportunities, but also for people in the wider community as well. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about why offshore wind and how that sits alongside what Victoria is already doing in renewable energy. So you can see there why offshore wind. Sorry, okay. So I'll just go over some of the things that are already happening in Victoria. And so Victoria is already leading the country on wind and solar, has some very important policies on renewable energy, most notably the state renewable energy targets of to reach 40% renewables by 2025 and 50% by 2030. We've also seen the state Labor government roll out a series of renewable energy auctions, which basically secure investment in new wind and solar farms. This is largely to support the onshore sector. We also have the Vic Solar Homes program, which aims to roll out 2.5 million homes of rooftop solar, which is amazing. Grants to support community-owned renewables, and we also have this, the establishment of Vic Grid, which will coordinate transmission infrastructure development. So offshore wind is amazing because this is happening on top of everything that's happening onshore. So we're already transforming the energy system onshore. We're going to get to 50% renewables. And so offshore wind is an opportunity to take us even further beyond that. And we've seen the state government announce really important targets, which Naomi spoke about before. So this is a screen grab from the state government's recent discussion paper on offshore wind, which sets out their rolling targets over the next 20 years to 2040. And it identifies two key regions for offshore wind, most notably Gippsland in the east and Portland in the west. And to give you an idea, so Naomi's example was comparing Star of the South with your lawn. So this is a whole order of magnitude on top of that, because this is not just one project, this is several projects. So Star of the South would be around 2 to 2.0 gigawatts, which is roughly the equivalent of a coal-fired power station. If Victoria builds 10 gigawatts of offshore wind in Gippsland, that's more than the existing generation from the current coal-fired power stations. And that's on top of what's already being produced in the west of the state, on people's homes, around the city and around the regions. So this industry could really see Victoria exporting renewable energy to other states, helping power electric vehicles, the creation of new sectors like renewable hydrogen. It's really a very significant opportunity. Okay, sorry, the slides have somewhat changed here, but that's okay, just bear with me. The other reason that we think it's really important to look at this industry is the proximity to the Latrobe Valley, which is going through this transition away from the coal-fired power stations. But there is also the existing onshore and offshore gas sectors that are present in that region, which are also industries that need to transition, where there is a need to create alternative forms of employment for the workers in those industries. And what we see internationally from the UK, Friends of the Earth UK and the union movement over there have done research on this, and that identified that the offshore wind industry is uniquely placed to transition workers in offshore oil and gas into offshore wind, and that their skills are very comparable to what's needed in offshore wind. So that's a fantastic opportunity to grow those jobs for workers in those sectors and make sure that we don't leave anyone behind as we act on climate change. And that really explains why there has been such strong support from the union movement as well as the climate movement for this sector. So the union movement doesn't always support the rollout of renewables because it faces issues with the conditions for workers and what that means for workers in existing industries. But with offshore wind, we've really seen the union movement seize the opportunity and put itself in the position where it wants to be part of the conversation. And so we've seen support from the Victorian Trades Hall, the Maritime Union, Manufacturing Workers Union, Electrical Trades Union, Gippsland Trades and Labour Council. This is quite a big shift in the attitudes of the union movement towards the energy transition. And it shows that they're seeing with offshore wind, they can have a transition that's going to work for their members, and it's going to remove the barriers to accelerating the transition away from coal-fired power stations and other fossil fuels. So So that's really significant. And this is more on the jobs aspect for regions like Gippsland, is not just to build the wind turbines and power the state, it's also to create new manufacturing opportunities. And so our modelling, when we looked at the Star of the South, found that if there was domestic manufacturing included in the plan to build offshore wind, we could almost treble the amount of jobs. So that's a really interesting way that we could look at offshore wind into the future. And I've already spoken about what that means for coal regions. So we've got these amazing renewable energy policies in Victoria. We've got these offshore wind targets, but there are some things missing. And that's what does the transition mean for communities like Latrobe Valley? What does it mean for the workers? And offshore wind's really at the intersection of all of these issues. And so, over the next couple of years, that's something that we'll be looking closely at. And I'm sure that, the union movement and other movements will be looking at that as well. The other thing that's amazing is the breadth of support that's come out about this sector. So it hasn't just been climate groups and unions backing it in, it's also been members of the coalition. And so one of the most notable supporters of offshore wind federally has been Darren Chester, who's a member of the Nationals Party. And he obviously spoke about when the legislation to begin the industry passed in federal parliament, he spoke about what it means for his community and the opportunities that it creates. And so with the state election coming up later in this year, we're really looking to what are the opposition offering in Victoria on industries like this. We know that the Labor government is going big, it's ambitious, it wants to act on climate change, it wants to create jobs. Will the Liberal Party or other parties meet that challenge as well? And so at this point, it's a bit of an open-ended question for people like Shadow Climate Minister James Newbury, whether they're going to follow the lead of people like Darren Chester and seize the opportunities in this sector as well. So that's a little bit of a let's see. Obviously, starting a whole new industry is quite a significant challenge. We don't have any existing offshore wind turbines. We don't manufacture the towers. We don't necessarily have the ports to support the development of this infrastructure. Star of the South is one project, but we're really looking at building multiple gigawatts of offshore wind over the next 2 decades in Victoria. So that is to seize the opportunities in that industry and make sure that we're getting the most benefit. That's going to be a really big challenge for government. So there are some open-ended questions here, about whether Victoria will be successful in setting up a domestic manufacturing workforce. Will we see this industry deliver benefits to local communities on top of employment? What does it mean for the natural environment? People in coastal regions do really care about where they live. And I'll talk about, how this, might be improved in the future. And will the industry deliver best practice and bring communities along? This is really, really important. I spend some of my time in places where people are not necessarily fond of renewable energy projects. They might feel that renewable energy is changing the character of where they live. They might feel that it threatens, the birds, the species that live in their backyard. Obviously, when you build a project offshore, that may simplify some of those questions. But I suspect that we are going to see similar issues come up with the industry over time. And so I think it's really important that the offshore wind sector doesn't necessarily, think that, this is just going to be simple because it's offshore. People do really care about their backyard, coastal communities included. And I think that everything that Naomi spoke about before, about the partnerships with universities, monitoring, etc., is really what we need to be doing more of, and what we need to see more of from other players in the sector to make sure that we're not seeing projects, create problems unnecessarily from the beginning. So this is an example of how you can do that well, and this is actually taken from the Star of the South's development processes. And so they're obviously building the wind turbines offshore, as you've seen, but you do need to connect those wind turbines to the transmission line at some point. And so what you're looking at here is 3 different transmission route options where the project could connect at the coastline and then eventually feed into transmission in Latrobe Valley. And I just wanted to bring this up as an example of how companies can actually engage on the way they develop these very large-scale projects in communities in a way that is open. And so what Star of the South did was they canvassed 3 different options for the transmission route corridor, and they did extensive consultation, the multi-criteria analysis that Naomi spoke about. This is really important because some of the transmission routes went through native forest, and in our personal experience, Star of the South to be really good to work with, and identifying that this is actually something that's really important to people in that region. People don't want to see native forests unnecessarily removed in order to build transmission, if that's possible. And I think that's quite different to what we've seen from some other developers and some other transmission companies. And so this model of early engagement from corporate players is going to be really important for the way that this sector develops into the future. And we'd really hope to see other companies replicate that style of community engagement. So although I'm highlighting that there are those concerns, I do want to acknowledge that there has been great work that's been done to date, and I feel optimistic that those challenges can be faced. So where are we up to now? So at the moment, the state government is conducting a consultation on its offshore wind policy, or what it calls its offshore wind policy directions paper, which is a bit of a mouthful. But this is a really important opportunity for people that care about these issues, how the development of offshore wind and new industries brings communities along, and how we protect nature. That's a really important opportunity to send a message to government that about what issues matter to you. So if you care about that, I'd encourage you to make a submission. I believe Lighter Footprints has already made a submission, which is fantastic. What we're doing on the ground in Gippsland is kicking off a series of community conversations to understand what people in that region want to see from this sector. What kinds of jobs do they want to see? What concerns do they have? And we want to take that, test out what people actually are concerned about and make sure that's addressed early on. And we'll also be doing that at a bit more of a statewide level through surveying. So those are just some simple next steps. I also mentioned before the issues around, where different political parties stand, and that's going to be something that's our focus through the rest of the year. So if that's something you're keen to get involved with, get in touch. We always, I've just lost the last slide. We always need more people to get involved in campaigning, doing things like political strategy, organising, running events, social media, everything that Lighter Footprints does. We also need to do that at that statewide level on these issues, which is a great opportunity to get involved. So I'll be around, say g'day. But I think that's everything for me. Thanks for having me, and see you around.
Okay, so the effect of sound, so the construction sound and the operation sound on maritime life.
Thank you. It's a great question, and really one that's very important when it comes to looking at planning an offshore wind farm, but also how you then construct it, the techniques you use, and very importantly, how you control the sound that you're generating. So an offshore wind farm, generally speaking, most of the noise is created during the construction period, because that's when, if you're using technology like monopiles, which is what Star of the South are proposing, there is piling activity, which is similar to what you see onshore. You know, it's basically drilled down and hammered down into the seabed to a depth of around about, for Star of the South, around about 40 metres. To the point that you've got the necessary competency to ensure that the turbine is stable and that you can certify it and make sure that it's safe. So that noise, in terms of the sound that's insonified when you are installing those turbines, it's really important that we understand the spatial aspect of that. How far can that travel? And noise in water travels further than noise in air. So we basically collect all this marine mammal data. So we've been studying the marine mammals in terms of aerial surveys of them twice a month, but also looking at them around the historical data that's available on them, and also using the expertise of experts like Curtin University, who've been studying them for many years. To get an idea of the numbers of marine mammals we're seeing, the times of years that they're in and around the Gippsland area, whether they are, moving in terms of migrating north-south, which you see quite often, obviously with the humpbacks, and that's quite a famous one. But also the southern right whales who come in more, hug the coast, especially with their calves. And also the foraging behaviour that you might see from the pygmy blues, for example. So we've taken 2 years' worth of data so that we're able to see whether there's a seasonal difference, and that data is then used in informing what is an impact assessment, underwater noise impact assessment, where you use a numerical model that's fed in, the information's fed in by, if you like, lots of data that's been gathered from other wind farms around the world, as well as actual data around the sound that you can generate when installing these particular piles with particular hammer energies that you're using. And the model is run past the regulators. So at the moment, the environmental impact statement is being regulated by the Department of the Environment on the federal side. And we're also doing an environmental effects statement, which is the state process. And they have particular interest in marine mammals, especially when they're in 3 nautical miles, and the noise can travel to the coast as much as it can travel offshore. So in those processes, we run past the methodologies with the regulators. They've got their experts, including the Antarctic Division, etc. They then provide their input, and they agree that the methods are sound in terms of being able to determine the level of impact. So that all happens in the background, and then it gets presented to the public. And at that point, we'll have an idea about the amount of sound that's generated, but also what the mitigation will need to be to bring the sound into an acceptable level where we're not adversely impacting. And that's in the form of what they call, sort of temporary threshold shifts. That's where the mammals become disturbed because they hear the noise and they stop doing what they're doing, and they don't migrate or they don't forage, they move away. Or it can be worse than that, it can be injury. So we have to make sure that we are working within the environmental protection laws, and that we are limiting as much as we can the noise from the installation of the wind farm. So that's really where we get the most noise. Then during operation, that's an area that's pretty new in terms of impact assessment. They're only really seeing noise being generated by these very large turbines. And it's an area that we're looking at as one of the first things Star of the South is doing for the industry. So, all that will be covered, and it will be made public at the point where the impact assessment and the environmental effects statement are prepared and produced. Probably a bit long-winded, but...
Yeah, cool. It's hard to beat that level of detail, but really, really great question, and I think one that's on the minds of many people who live in places where they're by the coast. I think we're really looking at it in terms of how the construction is planned. Naomi mentioned the migration routes of the whales. Ideally the construction periods would be planned around that to minimise the impact on whales. We don't want to see impacts on whales. And because this is the start of a whole new industry as well, you know, Star of the South is one project, but there are these kind of regulations that sit above that around where the projects can or cannot be built. And so an important consideration is, you know, drawing a line on the map of where projects can or cannot be built. The migration of whales is a really important consideration in how the federal government designs those what are called offshore electricity areas or offshore wind zones, if you like. So all of that needs to go into the design of any of the policies, you know, to make sure that from the earliest stage possible, we're preventing any impacts on whales, which is such an important species. And obviously, Friends of the Earth, we support renewable energy as a climate solution, but we also care about mammals and, you know, marine species is so important, and, you know, whales in particular. So there may be areas or there may be projects where we say, no, this is an unacceptable impact. You know, you cannot or should not do this here. And so those are some of the challenges that the environment and climate movement is likely to face over the next couple of decades, you know, with this industry and you know, other large-scale onshore renewable energy projects as well. So it needs to be done sensitively.
Explain how the lifetime of the project is 30 years.
So 30 years is the time that's set at the moment by the federal government's legislation. So they allow you to lease the seabed for a 30-year period when it comes to building, operating the wind farm. Now there is a potential to extend, but it's no guarantee. And what we see in you know, sort of all sort of forms of wind is that there's always an opportunity potentially to repower. But the warranties that the offshore wind turbine suppliers provide, they tend to last for a certain period of time. So that's generally why you set that 30 years. But it's not that the wind turbine couldn't still generate beyond that point. That may well be the case. But yeah, it's generally set by what you can achieve in terms of the security over the land that you're placing the turbines on, and also what the manufacturers will warrant you for in terms of the lifetime of the turbine.
All right, I am going to now hand over, thank you Julian for conducting that. I'm going to hand over to Ray to give a report on light footprints letters.